Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. With us today is Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, a controversial biologist, author of A New Science of Life, and also author of The Presence of the Past, released in February 1988 by Times Books. Dr. Sheldrake is educated at Harvard and at Cambridge universities and has caused quite a stir in the scientific world. Welcome, Rupert.
Thank you.
When A New Science of Life was published, Nature magazine, the prestigious British science journal, called it probably the best candidate for book burning that had appeared this century. I believe it comments along those lines.
Yes.
Your approach to biology has been one of challenging the mechanistic, reductionistic worldview that has been dominant for most of the last 100 years in that field.
That's right, yes.
And I gather you've done this because you're looking at the unsolved problems that exist in biology.
Yes. The mechanistic approach, which is the attempt to reduce the phenomena of life to physics and chemistry, to explain life in terms of mechanisms, and which is basically the idea that living organisms, such as you and me, are nothing but complicated machines. This approach has been very successful in certain ways, especially in biochemistry, molecular biology, and physiology. But it's not been so successful in understanding how embryos develop, how more form comes from less form, how plants grow from seeds, how flatworms regenerate, how organisms can grow from parts, as they do when you take a cutting of a plant, or how animal instincts work, or, of course, how the mind works. All these have remained very mysterious.
I suppose one of the reasons that your work was considered so controversial is because you took the data of parapsychology and used this as an example of the kind of phenomenon that seems to really resist reductionist thinking.
Yes, although I don't deal much with parapsychology. I use it as one example. I don't think one needs to go as far as parapsychology. I mean, the mere fact of consciousness resists reductionist thinking by itself.
You were accused of giving comfort to the parapsychologists,
however.
Yes.
Oh, yes. And indeed, I'm perfectly happy with that. But I think that the problems of biology that are unsolved are much closer to us than parapsychology, although that's one of them. And my starting point was the unsolved problem of embryology, how it is that a fertilized egg grows into an embryo and becomes an organism.
The orthodox view here being that it all can be explained by the genetic code, by DNA and RNA.
Yes, the standard view is that the whole of this can be explained in terms of genetic programming written into the DNA. At first sight, that sounds quite plausible, and the idea of the genetic program is commonly used in ordinary everyday conversation as a kind of explanation for everything. Why do swallows migrate? Because they're genetically programmed to do so. Why do spiders spin webs? Because they're genetically programmed to do so. It explains everything, but actually, when you come to think of it, nothing in any detail. And the reason why it's a problem in the realm of form is fairly easy to understand if you think of your own arm and leg. And the arm and the leg have exactly the same chemicals in them, the same proteins, the same bone chemicals, the same nerve chemicals, the same kinds of cells, and indeed the same DNA. The DNA is the same in all the cells of the body.
Yet they have different functions.
Yeah, they have different functions and different forms. And if the DNA alone were enough to specify the form, then how come the same DNA can specify different forms in different parts of the body?
Especially since they both originated from the same cell at one point.
Yes, they all come from the same cell, and all the different cells that cell gives rise to do different things, eye cells, ear cells, spleen cells, and so on. Now, if all these cells are programmed identically, they have identical DNA, how come they develop differently? Well, at this stage, the conventional approach has to say, well, there must be something else acting on the cells and on the DNA, and this is usually called something like complex spatio-temporal physico-chemical patterns of interaction not yet fully understood.
In other words, I suppose it's fair to say that even the most orthodox of biologists, although they might not like to do so, would admit that this is an unsolved problem.
Yes, and I think that there's nobody in mainstream biology who would claim this problem is solved. It's one of the main unsolved problems of biology. One does meet people who know very little about biology who assume it was all solved years ago, but no one who knows the field would claim that. It is a field in which a great deal of research is going on today, but where even those at the leading edge of the subject aren't quite clear what new directions it should go in.
And you see yourself as part of a tradition which actually goes back quite a long way in biology, that is a counterpoint to the reductionistic, mechanistic view, more along the lines of the life energy or the vitalist tradition in biology.
Yes, I mean, but these controversies in modern biology have a long history, and so for at least 300 years, in fact. When the mechanistic worldview came in physics in the 17th century, there was an immediate attempt to extend it to life, to say that just as the universe is a giant machine, so living organisms are machines. But right from the beginning this was controversial, because there were some people who said, wait a minute, there are a lot of things about animals and plants and ourselves that don't seem to be like machines, even the fanciest machines you can imagine. And so there's been a long tradition of people arguing there must be something more to life than mere physics and chemistry. And what I'm doing is in that long tradition. This controversy has been raging in biology intermittently, as I say, for 3 centuries. For the last 50 years or so, the controversy has mainly been between the mechanists on the one hand and the holists, or the organismic biologists on the other.
Systems theorists, basically.
One kind of holist is the systems theorist, yes.
People who say that an organism is more than just the sum of its parts.
That's right. The general idea that the organism is more than the sum of its parts. And the problem, of course, when you say that, which I'm sure is true, is then, well, what is this more? Just what is it? And that is the big problem, to say what this more is.
That is, some people might say, well, it's more than just the sum of its parts, but ultimately it's still all a materialistic universe, and in some sense we don't have to incorporate any new energies. And then there might be others who say, no, we have to have a new energy, a life force, or something distinct.
Yes. Well, what's changed the situation in the last 50 years from the period before that is that whereas before people said either it's matter or energy, which is what physics and chemistry deal with, or it's a life force which is totally mysterious. What's happened is that physics and chemistry don't just have matter and energy now, they have fields. And fields are invisible organizing regions of influence, like the magnetic field around a magnet. And fields have holistic properties. If you think of a magnet, just a regular, ordinary iron bar magnet, if you cut the magnet in two, you don't get 2 half magnets, you get 2 small but complete magnets, each with a complete field. Fields have a kind of inbuilt holistic property. Fields are more than matter, at least in their extent, and according to modern physics, matter arises from fields rather than fields from matter. So what's changed is that it's now possible, and has been since the 1920s, to say that what the organizing factors in living organisms are fields, new kinds of fields, not yet recognized by physics. And to say that is to go beyond the idea there's an ineffable vital factor which can't be named, or nothing more can be said about it, beyond saying it's mysterious and vital. we can now talk in terms of organizing fields.
What you call morphic fields.
What I call morphic fields, the word morphic coming from the Greek word morphe, meaning form. And the idea of morphic fields organizing living organisms was first put forward in the 1920s. And this idea, under the name morphogenetic fields, is widely accepted in biology today.
Mm-hmm.
The big problem has been to say what these fields are and how they work. And that's the starting point for my hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. So you've developed a hypothesis, I suppose, almost a theory at this point, in that you've worked out many of the details of how we develop from a single egg, a single cell, to the complex organisms that we are under the influence of these morphic fields.
That's right, yes. I've taken the idea that development proceeds under the influence of these fields, which is a standard and accepted idea, and then ask the question, what are these fields and how do they work?
And I suppose really where your work has become quite controversial is that you suggest that these fields somehow transcend space and time.
Well, what I suggest is that that transcends, possibly misleading is a term. The field, your field is in and around you, my field's in and around me. The field of a rabbit or a cat is in and around the organism. On an oak tree, it's in and around the tree. So they're local in one sense. But the new part of the hypothesis, and the controversial part, is the idea that the fields of different organisms of the same species are linked up together through space and time, especially from the past. And this means that the field of a rabbit, for example, is influenced by the fields of other rabbits, not just present ones but past ones too. And by a process I call morphic resonance, the influence of like upon like through or across space and time, the field of the rabbit has a kind of collective memory of the rabbit species. It's, in fact, the bearer of a kind of habit, if you like, a rabbit habit. And so one could say that nature has a rabbit habit, which is embodied in the morphic field of the rabbit. And as the rabbit embryo develops, the field shapes it in accordance with the way rabbits developed that way before. So rabbits are as they are because they were as they were. And there's a kind of inbuilt memory in the field.
I suppose the intriguing thing about this hypothesis, and perhaps why it's of great importance to the biological community today, is that it's, unlike the earlier vitalistic theories, this is a testable notion.
Yes, the whole point of this as a scientific hypothesis is that it can be tested. And to give an example, it's easiest to take the realm of behavior, because the hypothesis applies not only to the development of form, the development of embryos, but also to patterns of behavior. Those too, I believe, are organized by morphic fields. So what the theory says is that if you train rats to learn a new trick, say in California, then the mere learning of this by the rats here should make it easier for rats all over the world to learn the same thing quicker. So the more rats that learn it in California, the easier it should get for rats everywhere else, just because the rats have learned it here.
And by learning it here, they then establish some type of morphic field or morphic resonance.
That's right. And this works through or across space and time. It's almost like magic. I mean, I'm not suggesting this is carried by DNA or by people calling up other scientists or by taking rats that squeak and tell the others how to do it. But just without the other rats knowing it at all, it happens automatically.
And you originally, I gather, looked through the annals of science and found certain anomalous effects like this. Rats were suddenly learning mazes that they hadn't been trained to learn and things of this sort.
Yes, well, when I thought of it, I thought, well, if this happens, then people should have noticed it, and if this is a real effect. Of course, nobody had actually written that they'd seen this kind of thing and called it morphic resonance or formative causation, which is what I call this hypothesis. But I did look through the literature and I found there are many examples that are suspiciously like this. The best known series of experiments, which I describe in my book, A New Science of Life, was carried on over a period of 40 years, started in Harvard, continued in Edinburgh and concluded in Australia. And it turned out that rats learning to escape from a water maze by swimming out of it got better and better as generations went on. By the end of the series of experiments, they were learning on average 10 times quicker than the rats had to begin with. This was a big effect. It was not some tiny statistical thing. It was a 10-fold increase. And moreover, this rate of learning turned up all over the world and in all rats of the breed. It didn't matter whether these rats were descended from trained parents or from untrained parents. All the rats of the breed seemed to be getting better everywhere in the world. Now that's just the kind of effect that I think would happen, and it's already amply documented in the literature. Of course, most scientists would say, oh, well, maybe it happened, but it doesn't prove morphic resonance. There must be some other explanation. So then I say to them, well, what is the other explanation? They say, well, we can't think of it right now, or maybe it was the experimenters, or maybe it was some unknown variables, but whatever it is, it can't be morphic resonance. So in the end, this issue will have to be decided by new, specially designed
further
experiments.
replications.
Yes.
Have there been additional replications or other studies that have been conducted now based on your hypothesis?
There have. When my book was first published in the United States in 1982, the Tarrytown group of New York announced an international competition running for 3 years for the best tests of this hypothesis, with a first prize of $10,000. And then there were 2 further prizes. Well, this competition stirred up quite a lot of international interest and triggered off 1 or 2 other competitions for ideas for testing the theory. The Tarrytown one was for experiments that had actually been done. The closing date was at the beginning of 1986, and the entries were judged by a panel of international scientists. I was, of course, not a judge myself, and the prize could be won for experiments that either supported or went against the theory. As it happened, the 3 winning entries were all in the realm of human psychology, in the realm of human learning. All 3 of them supported the hypothesis. And this has triggered off quite a lot of further interest in testing it, and new experiments are now underway in universities in Britain and elsewhere.
As I recall, one of these experiments had to do with children learning nonsense syllables. Is that correct?
Well, one of the proposed experiments concerned nursery rhymes. The idea was that because millions of, say, Japanese children have learned regular, ordinary Japanese nursery rhymes over the years, it should be easier for an American presented with a regular Japanese nursery rhyme and 1 or 2 other rhymes that are very similar to it, designed to be as similar as possible in rhyme structure and ease or difficulty of learning. When memorizing these in Japanese, without knowing which is which, the old nursery rhyme should be easier to learn than the others. This turns out to be the case. I've done that experiment. But the experiment can't be conclusive because you can never prove that the new rhymes are intrinsically as easy or as difficult as the old ones.
Linguistically equivalent.
That's right. You could never actually prove that. Nevertheless, the result's encouraging. The experiments that won the Tarrytown Prize were more tightly designed and much more persuasive, I think, in the evidence they presented.
Could you enumerate one?
One of them, done by Professor Gary Schwartz of Yale University, he's a professor of psychology there, involved 3-letter Hebrew words written in Hebrew from the Old Testament. And he worked out, his idea was this, that the Old Testament's been read by Hebrew reading people, Jews and others, for thousands of years. Therefore, the pattern of the words, each individual word, has been recognized millions of times over a very long period of time. There should therefore be a kind of morphic resonance for each of these words, the gestalt or pattern of the word, when perceived by somebody who doesn't know Hebrew, should be easier to recognize than a non-word in Hebrew. And he produced non-words by taking, in fact, he took 48 regular, proper 3-letter words from the Old Testament, and then for each of these he made a non-word by rearranging the 3 letters so that it was a meaningless anagram.
But more linguistically equivalent.
Yes. And then tested these on groups of subjects who didn't know Hebrew. And it turned out that it was much easier for people to recognize the real Hebrew words than the false ones.
In some kind of short-term memory tests, I gather.
Well, yes. How he actually did it was that people were shown one at a time without knowing some were real and false words. They were asked to guess the meaning in English and then to give the confidence they felt in their guess. Now, some people got the guesses right, so he eliminated them on the grounds that they might have known some Hebrew, even though they said they didn't. Of course, it could have been a much more interesting effect than that.
Yeah.
But he took only people who guessed falsely. And what he found, rather to his surprise, was that people rated their guesses with much greater confidence when they were guessing from real words than from false words. And it seemed to be due to some kind of unconscious sense of familiarity with the real words. He called it an unconscious pattern recognition effect.
I see.
And this effect showed up much more strongly with common words from the Old Testament than with rare words from the Old Testament. And he concluded that morphic resonance would be the most reasonable explanation of the results. But this is only a beginning, of course, and further experiments are already going on. And, but it does show that this apparently outrageous hypothesis can actually be tested relatively easily, and most impressive of all, for virtually no financial cost.
One of the issues that you've raised, I suppose, reopens something of a Pandora's box, really, is the whole question of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, or Lamarckian evolution.
Yes, well, the inheritance of acquired characteristics is one of the great and bitter controversies in the history of biology, second only to the bitterness of the controversy over vitalism versus mechanism. According to the Mendelian orthodox neo-Darwinian doctrine, acquired characteristics, for example something that you or I learn, can't be inherited by offspring, by our children, genetically, or they could be passed on culturally, of course, by teaching. But there's no way they can be transmitted genetically, because genes just don't work like that according to the ordinary theory. And the basic argument is acquired characteristics can't be inherited according to genetic theory. Therefore, they aren't.
In other words, if I work out as an athlete and develop a very, very strong body, my children are not necessarily going to be born with all the muscles that I developed.
Or even a tendency to being athletes. Of course, these effects show up statistically, and where one would expect to see them would be in experiments like ones with rats. In fact, the experiments that I described that showed an increased rate of learning in rats over the generations were done originally to test for the inheritance of acquired characteristics. They showed that rats descended from trained parents did learn the thing quicker and quicker. And at first it was thought this was due to a genetic modification. When it turned out that all rats of the breed were learning it quicker and quicker, it showed that it wasn't a Lamarckian effect, because even rats descended from untrained parents were getting it quicker. Now, Lamarckian inheritance would say it should only go to the offspring. The hypothesis of formative causation, my idea, would say that it should go to all rats, irrespective of whether they're descended from the trained ones or not. And that's actually what happened.
It might be worth mentioning, parenthetically, how this controversy has affected biology in the Soviet Union, where it was held seriously for quite a while.
Oh yes, the inheritance of
view.
the Lamarckian view, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, has been heretical in the West since the 1920s. And it's been pretty firmly stamped out within orthodox biology. But the opposite prevailed in the Soviet Union, and from the 30s until the 60s, the inheritance of acquired characteristics was the orthodoxy, and Mendelianism was persecuted. So the very fact it got politically polarized didn't help people to see this in a calm or dispassionate manner. What I would say is that both sides were actually wrong. One side says you can't have genetic modification and an inheritance of acquired characteristics. The other side says you can. And I would say that you can have an inheritance of acquired characteristics without genetic modification. Like training rats here will enable other rats in New York to learn the same thing easier. Without them changing genetically. It's just because they're rats. It's because of this kind of collective memory. So this is like Lamarckism, but it goes much further. If you like, it's kind of super Lamarckism, rather than and very different from the conventional view.
So what, in effect, you're saying is that the conventional Lamarckian view, which was the Soviet view until 1964, and the conventional Mendelian view both did fail to take into account your hypothesis of the morphic fields.
That's right, and doing that and seeing it that way enables one to see that the Mendelians were right in saying that acquired characteristics can't modify the genes. They don't. But the Lamarckians were right in saying acquired characteristics can be inherited. They are, and there's good evidence for that.
And only the mechanism would be a non-genetic
That's
mechanism.
right, and I think it happens by non-genetic means.
Well, let's talk a little bit in the few remaining minutes about the nature of the morphic fields themselves. This must be quite controversial, since you've mentioned that the resonance can go beyond space and time. Do you have any sense of what the implications of this is?
Well, the exact nature of the morphic fields is hard to specify. You can describe them mathematically, and already mathematical models have been made of these fields. But of course, mathematics is mathematics, and it doesn't perhaps tell us what we might want to know. Fields in general are mysterious. I mean, we bandy around words like electromagnetic field. I'm seeing you through the electromagnetic field right now, through light. But we don't actually know what these things are. You know, in radio and TV work on electromagnetic fields. We can describe them with equations, we can model them, but if you say, well, what really is the electromagnetic field? The scientific answer is, well, it just is the electromagnetic field. That's what it is. We only know it through its effects. Same with gravitational fields.
Well, one thing we would know, though, is electromagnetic fields don't normally have effects that go across time and space.
Well, they do, actually. When we see a distant star, we're seeing a star that we're seeing things that happened actually tens of thousands of years ago. And curiously enough, those fields do go across time and space.
In the same sense that you mean?
No, not in the same sense that I mean, but ordinary fields do go across.
We've just got less than a minute left, though, so I'm afraid we may not be able to tie this up so neatly.
No. Anyway, what I'd say in conclusion is that the point of these fields is that they should be known by their effects. And what's new is the idea that these fields have a kind of inbuilt memory. And this means there's a kind of memory in nature. And it accumulates through time. And I think it plays an extremely important role in the evolutionary process.
Rupert Sheldrake, thank you very much for being with me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for being with us.